Between 1876 and 1878, a single climate event killed somewhere between 30 and 60 million people. Not a war, not a plague. A shift in ocean temperatures thousands of miles away that quietly unraveled monsoon rains across 3 continents at once. Historians call it the global famine. Climate scientists have since traced its cause directly back to one of the most powerful El Niño events ever recorded. And the unsettling part isn't just how many people died. It's that the exact atmospheric mechanism behind that catastrophe hasn't gone anywhere, and today's warmer, more crowded planet may be even less prepared to absorb it than the world was a century and a half ago. This is the story of the deadliest climate disaster in recorded history, and why? Scientists say the next super El Niño could hit a world with even less room to survive it. Let's be precise before we go further, because history this significant deserves careful, accurate treatment. What we're going to walk through is the documented mechanism behind that 1876 to 1878 catastrophe, why El Niño events can disrupt weather patterns across half the globe simultaneously, and why researchers are increasingly concerned about how a similarly powerful event would interact with the pressures already straining today's food and water systems. Start with what El Niño actually is, because the term gets thrown around constantly without most people understanding the mechanism behind it. El Niño describes a periodic warming of surface waters across the central and eastern tropical Pacific Ocean, part of a larger, irregular cycle that also includes its cooler counterpart, La Niña. This warming isn't confined to the ocean itself. It fundamentally reshapes atmospheric circulation patterns across enormous stretches of the planet at once. Now understand why that matters so profoundly for something as far away as monsoon rainfall over India or China. Ocean temperature drives atmospheric pressure patterns, and pressure patterns drive wind and moisture transport across entire continents. A strong El Niño can suppress the monsoon systems that hundreds of millions of people in Asia have depended on for consistent agricultural rainfall for thousands of years, while simultaneously triggering drought conditions across parts of Africa, Australia, and South America. That's exactly the mechanism behind the 1876 to 1878 catastrophe. Historical climate reconstructions point to one of the strongest El Niño events in the past several centuries occurring during this period, and its effects rippled across multiple continents in near-perfect alignment with the disaster's geography. Regions as far apart as northern China, southern India, northeastern Brazil, and parts of southern Africa all experienced severe drought conditions within the same general time frame, a geographic spread that would be difficult to explain through coincidence alone, and one that later climate reconstructions have tied directly back to the same underlying Pacific Ocean disruption. Read that again slowly. Not one region suffering a bad harvest. Multiple major agricultural regions across different continents failing during the same narrow window, because they were all connected to the same underlying oceanic and atmospheric disruption. Here's where the historical disaster becomes even more disturbing. The famine's devastation wasn't purely a story of failed rainfall. Historians studying the period have documented how colonial economic policies in British India and other affected regions actively worsened the crisis, continuing grain exports and rigid taxation systems, even as local populations starved, transforming a severe but survivable drought into a catastrophic mass famine. That combination, an extreme climate trigger colliding with fragile, poorly adapted human systems, is exactly the pattern climate historians point to as the real lesson buried inside this disaster. The El Niño event created the conditions. The human systems in place at the time determined just how catastrophic those conditions became. Historians studying the period, most notably in detailed academic reconstructions of the era, have described how railway networks built primarily to move grain toward export ports rather than toward famine-stricken interior regions actually accelerated the crisis in parts of India, moving food away from starving populations rather than toward them. Relief efforts that did exist were often deliberately limited by administrators concerned about discouraging self-reliance among affected populations, a policy stance historians now widely regard as having dramatically worsened the human toll of an already severe natural drought. Now here's why scientists are watching for this pattern to repeat, and why the specific comparison to today's world is so concerning. El Niño events themselves haven't disappeared. The cycle continues today exactly as it always has, and modern El Niño events, including a particularly powerful one in the late 1990s, have produced widespread global weather disruption, extreme flooding in some regions, severe drought in others, and significant agricultural and economic damage worldwide. That late 1990s event alone was linked to billions of dollars in global economic damage and disrupted weather patterns across dozens of countries simultaneously, from severe flooding in parts of South America to devastating drought and wildfire conditions across Indonesia and other parts of Southeast Asia. even without producing a famine on the scale of 1876, thanks in large part to vastly improved global food distribution and disaster response systems. That event served as a stark modern reminder of just how far-reaching a single strong El Niño's effects can be. Let that land for a second. The same basic mechanism responsible for history's deadliest climate disaster is still active in the Pacific Ocean today, cycling through its natural pattern of warm and cool phases exactly as it has for thousands of years. To understand why a similarly powerful event today could prove even more consequential than a straightforward repeat of 1876, you have to understand how the underlying baseline conditions have shifted. Global average temperatures are now measurably higher than they were in the 19th century, meaning any El Niño-driven heat and drought stress layers on top of an already warmer world, rather than a comparatively cooler pre-industrial baseline. Population density compounds that risk considerably. The regions historically most vulnerable to El Niño-driven drought, South Asia, parts of East Africa, and sections of South America, are now home to vastly larger populations than they were a century and a half ago, meaning any comparable disruption to monsoon rainfall or agricultural output today would affect a dramatically larger number of people directly dependent on that same rainfall. Urbanization adds a further layer of complexity that didn't exist in the same way during the 1870s. Far more of today's global population lives in cities, dependent on food transported in from distant agricultural regions rather than grown locally, which means a disruption to a major growing region thousands of miles away can still translate directly into empty shelves and rising prices for urban populations who have no direct connection to the affected farmland at all. But that's not even the most concerning structural change. Modern agriculture, unlike the more localized farming systems of the 19th century, is now deeply interconnected through global trade and supply chains. A severe, simultaneous agricultural disruption across multiple major food-producing regions wouldn't stay, contained locally the way it might have in an earlier, less globally integrated era. It would ripple through international grain markets, affecting food prices and availability in countries far removed from the drought itself. Researchers studying global food security specifically flag this interconnection as a double-edged development. On one hand, modern trade networks and international aid systems can move food into affected regions far faster and more effectively than the colonial-era transport systems of the 1870s ever could. On the other hand, that same interconnection means a severe shock to 2 or 3 major grain exporting regions simultaneously could tighten global supply enough to spike prices worldwide, hitting import-dependent, lower-income countries hardest, even in nations that experience no direct climate disruption of their own. If you've made it this far, you're clearly someone who wants to understand the real historical pattern behind these headlines instead of just another vague climate warning. That's exactly the kind of viewer this channel is built for, so go ahead and subscribe if you want more deep dives like this one. Now let's be exactly as careful as the researchers studying this pattern are, because that precision protects you from overreaction. Scientists cannot predict with certainty when the next Super El Niño, matching the intensity of the 1876 event, will occur, since the cycle's exact timing and intensity depend on complex interactions within the ocean-atmosphere system that remain genuinely difficult to forecast years in advance. What researchers can say with more confidence is that El Niño events, when they do occur at significant strength, continue to demonstrably disrupt global weather patterns in ways consistent with the historical record, and that a repeat event of comparable intensity to 1876 would be interacting with a modern world carrying meaningfully different, and in several key respects more precarious, structural vulnerabilities than it did a century and a half ago. That distinction between an uncertain specific prediction and a well-documented structural vulnerability is exactly why climate and agricultural researchers argue this history deserves far more public attention than it currently receives, treating it as a genuine planning consideration rather than a closed historical chapter. So what does this actually mean for the world today? It means global food security planning increasingly has to account for the possibility of a major El Niño-driven disruption hitting multiple agricultural regions simultaneously. Precisely the scenario history shows is entirely possible, rather than merely theoretical. So what can you actually do with this information? Start by understanding that global food price volatility isn't purely a random economic phenomenon. It's often directly connected to specific climate patterns like El Niño affecting major growing regions simultaneously, and staying informed about that connection gives you real insight into why grocery prices sometimes shift the way they do. If you work in agriculture, supply chain management, or humanitarian planning, familiarizing yourself with El Niño monitoring and forecasting from organizations that track even outside those specific professional contexts, it's worth understanding which staple foods in your own diet are most exposed to this kind of climate disruption, since certain crops, including coffee, rice, and cocoa, have historically shown particular sensitivity to El Niño-driven weather shifts in their major growing regions. That awareness won't prevent a price spike, but it does explain why certain grocery categories sometimes shift in cost, even when nothing appears to have changed in your own local weather. Support organizations and policies focused on strengthening food security resilience in historically vulnerable regions, since the core lesson from 1876 wasn't simply that the climate event happened. It was that fragile, poorly adapted human systems turned a survival climate disruption into a catastrophic mass famine. Modern early warning systems, drought-resistant crop varieties, and international food reserve programs all exist specifically because of lessons drawn from disasters like this one, and supporting their continued funding and development is a direct, practical way to help ensure history's deadliest climate lesson doesn't need to repeat itself at anywhere near the same scale. And here's the step people consistently underestimate. Push back against the instinct to treat this as purely historical trivia. The same ocean cycle responsible for the deadliest climate disaster in recorded history remains fully active today, and understanding that connection is exactly what allows modern planning to actually learn from it rather than simply repeat it. Before you go, let us know in the comments if you'd heard about the 1876 global famine before this story, because most people have never connected it directly to El Nino, despite it being one of the deadliest disasters in human history. And if you want to keep tracking how this cycle continues to shape global weather and food security, stay subscribed, because we'll be following it closely as the pattern continues to unfold. Let's close where we started. 30 to 60 million people lost to a shift in ocean temperature most of them never knew existed. The mechanism behind that catastrophe never went away. It's still cycling through the Pacific today, and the world it would hit next carries more people, more heat, and more interconnected fragility than the one it broke apart a century and a half ago. That's the real weight of this history, and it's worth carrying forward long after this video ends. The 1876 famine wasn't simply a natural disaster that happened to the world. It was a natural trigger, colliding with human systems unprepared to absorb it. And understanding that distinction is exactly what gives today's world a genuine chance to respond differently the next time a similarly powerful El Niño arrives.